Well, hello and welcome to our webinar on U.S.-China relations, challenges and opportunities for American agriculture, brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural and Resource Economics. My name is David Ortega and I'm a CFORD board member and professor at Michigan State University. It is my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. It is CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I want to provide some background on today's topic. A recent 2023 Economic Research Service report revealed that the evolving dynamics between the United States and China are profoundly shaping the global landscape. This webinar will explore the implications of US-China relations for the agricultural sector, focusing on key issues such as the significance of these bilateral ties to American agriculture, the lasting effects of the US-China trade war, and the future outlook for trade relations. This discussion will also address the growing concerns surrounding Chinese ownership of US farmland while exploring potential areas for future cooperation that could benefit both nations and the broader agricultural community. This timely conversation will also provide valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in this pivotal relationship. CFAIR has assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work, starting with Holly Wong, a professor in the Department of Agricultural, Food and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Holly has held assistant, associate, and full professor positions at Washington State University, as well as Purdue University during the period of '97 to 2024. Dr. Wong's research covers topics like agricultural policies, consumer preferences, risks and finances, the interaction among agricultural production, food consumption, and the environment, as well as international markets. Sean Arita serves as a senior economist in the Office of the Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. In his role, Sean conducts economic analysis and advises senior officials in USDA regarding farm and commodity outlook, trade policy issues, geopolitical issues, supply chain disruptions, and other areas affecting the US farm economy. Sean conducts economic modeling and commodity forecasting, scenario-based policy analysis, economic analysis for arbitration of trade dispute cases, and has contributed publications in various agricultural economic journals. Wendong Zhang is an assistant professor and extension economist at the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. His research seeks to better understand the interplay between agriculture and the environment, farmland market, and Chinese agriculture. Wendong is currently a faculty affiliate at the Cornell Center for China Economic Research, as well as a faculty fellow at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, as well as a faculty fellow at the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research in Germany. Brian Lomer has over 25 years experience working on agricultural and economic issues in the academic, government, and the commercial sectors with a focus on China. In January of 2022, Brian took the position of professor and department head at California Polytechnic State University, Department of Agribusiness in San Luis Obispo, where he oversees a comprehensive undergraduate teaching and research program that emphasizes learning by doing and hands-on educational opportunities. Now, before we start, we wanted to explain how to ask questions during the webinar to make sure that you, the audience, knows how to engage. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing it into the box in the control display, accessed by clicking on the question drop-down as shown on the slide and sending it to the organizer. Now, I'll hand over the webinar to Holly Wong, who will start us off.
Hi, good afternoon. And thank David for organizing this session. And this is a very important information about U.S.-China relations to U.S. agriculture, the impact. So I want to start with emphasizing the importance. Next slide, please. Yeah, so United States is the world's largest agricultural exporting country. Its exports have grown to almost $200 billion in 2023. So you see the graph on the side. And this export is not only important to just the agriculture, it's important to the entire US economy. And as it can increase like 1.25 million full-time jobs, and about 500,000 are farm jobs. Next, please. Well, talking about US agriculture export, China is the world's largest agriculture importer. And also China has been the largest market for the US in the last decades, except during the trade war period. So you can see this graph that it lays out all the important importing countries, and China is the light yellow color, the bars at the bottom. So you see it's constantly increasing, and there's a dent during the trade war period, around 2018. And the latest year, 2023, China is still the largest. Look very close to the next two largest ones, like Canada and Mexico. And however, in Canada and Mexico are also agriculture exporters to the US market, while China is non-arguably the largest net importer of US agriculture products. Next, please. So what does China import? And the largest commodity is soybeans, and you see the following are corn, sorghum, cotton, beef, chicken, and others. So from these are all land-intensive, non-food field crops and meats that depends on these non-food crops as feed. So that reflects two facts. Number one, Chinese per capita farmland scarcity relative to the US determines its import demand. And second, China's policy of food grain self-sufficiency shapes its import. That's why China doesn't import a lot like food grains like rice or wheat, but feed grain, oilseed, those. So the constraints from the trade war and COVID time is a kind of overlap a little bit during the 2 years, well, dented this trend. Next, please. So what did China do during the that 2-year period? Does it continue import? Yes, it does. So these charts you see are the China agriculture commodity import charts during this period. And you see there is no dent. Well, China still imports. China just shift its importing source from the US to other exporting countries during the trade war. These cost US agricultural export from Chinese market only about $30 billion. How I calculate it, I just do a simple average, assume if the trend continue without the dent, and that would be $30 billion more export from the US. Well, this is equivalent to like 34,000 farm jobs lost during the period. Next, please. So although at that time, US direct our export to other countries, however, the price dropped. So here is the soybean price. For example, you see that again, it's getting pretty low during those few years. That means even though we exported our commodity to other countries, but overall we suffer lower price. Of course, that means lower revenue and some costs. So there is a fact at that time, Trump's administration provided about $28 billion aid to farmers who suffered from this Chinese retaliation during trade war. So that also confirms that our farmers actually suffered that loss. Next, please. So now they just, USDA also made a forecast for 2024. It's not a very optimistic year. So a forecast that Chinese market is going to be $1 billion short compared to a year before. So there are several reasons for that. One reason, of course, is the competition from Brazil is very strong. And the second reason is the exchange rate. So the stronger US dollar relative to Chinese currency, discouraging US export. And also Chinese own economy is not as strong as in the past few years, so it struggles a little bit. But another important factor is identified by USDA is that the political tension, such as Chinese land holding issues in the US that we're going to address later in this very same webinar, that make the Chinese government not very happy, and that also not helping with the Chinese import. Well, like we can look at the next slide. So here, so far, we're talking about how important the export to Chinese market is to our US agriculture. So now, how about the relation? Well, the Chinese government has a stronger influence on the agriculture commodity import markets than any other products because of this their food security concerns. So a lot of the import company in China are actually state-owned employees. So they really listen to what the government indicate for them to import or not to import from whom. And also Chinese government can give tariffs, that we see this during the trade war. And even other than the tariffs, there are other non-tariff influences. So Chinese government has a strong influence, and it does apply that influence to the grain market, especially importing market. Well, with this sustained cold relation between the two countries, and the Chinese consumers and also responded. Me and my team, we have done constantly Chinese consumers studies. We can tell that over time, and from like more than 10 years ago, Chinese consumers are really welcoming US food commodities and products, but now in recent years, and that attitude becomes not so promising. So also China has advocated grain over high valued commodities over recent years. That means the country may substitute the import of US large commodities to some fruits and vegetables from other countries. So all of these indicating the relationships are very important. So my very last slide, I just basically give a conclusion. So what my message are, one is US agriculture export is very important to the entire economy and to the agriculture economy. China has been the largest importer. Chinese government has a strong, powerful influence on its who what they want to import and who they want to import from, and that boils down to the US-China relationship is very important to the US agriculture. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly, for your presentation. I just want to remind everyone to send questions to the organizer using the question drop-down menu. And next, we will be hearing from Sean.
Thank you, David, and thanks for organizing this event. So Holly did a great job providing an overview of the US-China ag trade relations. In my presentation, I'm going to be focusing on reviewing the 2018-19 trade war and discuss some of the learning lessons from that event. Next slide, please. Okay, let me begin with some quick historical context. Holly, again, did a great job reviewing a lot of this trade. Very, very briefly, we can see how China started as a very limited market, roughly $500 million market for US ag exports. In 2001, China joins the WTO. We can see how that leads to this astronomical growth, fueled by rapid income growth, as well as reductions in trade barriers. In 2012, they hit $26 billion, and then our exports to China subsided under weaker commodity prices, growing competition, as well as various trade barriers. But then we can see it bottoming out heavily in 2018-19. That's the trade war, in which I'll discuss in more detail later. But we can also see after that, since then, exports have actually resurged under this post-pandemic boom that coincides with the Phase 1 agreement, as well as various market factors and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the trade war. In 2018, United States imposed Section 232, 301 tariffs. This wasn't just on China, it included other major trading partners like Mexico, Canada, EU, and others. These partners in turn responded with retaliatory tariffs. Agriculture in particular was heavily targeted. You can see on this chart on the right, soybeans was by far the most economically significant sector that had been hit. Also China, which is highlighted in blue, had imposed the most extensive tariffs, since they were also the ones that were the primary recipient of our tariffs. Next slide, please. So what was the impact on agriculture? Here we can draw upon extensive empirical analysis that has been conducted on this event. Myself and others have contributed several economic studies in this area. Here on this slide, I provide some summary findings from studies by Jason Grant and myself, as well as Colin Carter and Sandro. Using econometric gravity methods, we estimated the impact on US agricultural trade, finding a trade loss on the order of magnitude of $15 billion in annualized terms. In cumulative terms, over the 2-year period, it's over $27 billion of trade loss. The vast majority of these losses were to the Chinese market, with again, soybeans accounting for the largest share. Separately, Economic Research Service, in a study led by Stephen Morgan, looked at the impacts on the state level. They found that the Midwest was the hardest hit region, being attributed to that region's very high production concentrations of soybeans, sorghum, pork, commodities that are very much dependent upon the Chinese market. But again, the effects were very broad-reaching across the country. Next slide, please. Okay, I do have a few charts on soybeans. Again, this is the most economically significant commodity hit. Just very quickly, first on the left, we did see a fairly rapid response in terms of price reaction to the tariffs. US soybean futures dropped from about $11 a bushel to $8.50. Meanwhile, Brazilian soybeans, shown in the green, were supported by the tariff, and we saw this price wedge emerge of upwards of a $2.50 premium that the Brazilian soybeans carried over US soybeans. And I'll note that sometimes this price wedge exceeded 25%, since it was not only the tariff, but China was also pressuring or leaning on its state-owned enterprises to not purchase US soybeans outright. The trade war also disrupted logistic channels for US soybeans. In the map on the right, we saw this affected the basis, particularly in that Dakotas type of area, which was heavily dependent upon that Pacific Northwest channel. They faced extreme difficulty without the China market. In the study that Mike Pajimian led, we showed how this led to a severe weakening of the basis, with local cash soybean prices in North Dakota falling as low as $6 a bushel. Next slide, please. We did see some of our exports to alternative markets pick up. For instance, soybeans to the EU, Mexico, Taiwan, and others, they were up. But it was not enough to offset the losses to China. Some had hoped that the trade would adapt and we in the United States could backfill Brazil's export markets as they had increased their supply to China. But what we found was that this reshuffling was costly. The trade frictions did not, the trade frictions did lead to a very significant reduction in U.S. net exports. Next slide, please. So some long-term implications. So first of all, our exports did recover following the phase 1 agreement. China began granting waivers of retaliatory tariffs. Additionally, there was economic factors, and also China had strong demand during the post-pandemic period. This led to a resurgence of our exports. But we can see that our exports have lost significant ground compared to our main competitor, Brazil. For years, the U.S. was the leading exporter to China, but Brazil, which had been aggressively expanding over the past 2 decades, we saw them overtake us for soybeans in 2017. However, the trade did accelerate some of those developments of that growth. The retaliatory tariffs and tensions have had the effect of hurting our reputation as a reliable supplier. On the Brazilian side, it has also encouraged further investment in cropland expansion, as you can see there on the chart, with our future projections of much more levels of exports than we have. So ultimately, it had this effect of seeding expansion to Brazil. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I just wanted to make a point on this slide that the retaliatory tariffs are still on the books. Here's a nice chart from Jason Grant showing tariff waivers. They're not removed, they're just being granted waivers. China anytime can stop granting those waivers. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, last point I wanted to touch upon, U.S.-China, situation looking forward. Long held this relationship of mutual dependence. China are one of our main export markets. In turn, China's relied on the U.S. as their main supplier. Trade war, temporary breakup of the relationship, partially reconciled by phase 1. But in terms of decoupling, very quickly, what we can see here in this chart is that China has diversified more from the U.S. Since the trade war, looking towards Brazil and other countries as larger suppliers for their food. Meanwhile, though, the U.S., if you look on the chart on the right, still remains very much strongly dependent upon China's market. In fact, their share of our exports has actually increased since 2017. So anyways, I'll stop there. This was my last slide, and again, happy to take questions at the end. So I also left my email. Feel free to reach out later as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, John, for your presentation. And now I'd like to welcome Wendong. Wendong, we're not able to hear you. Just wanted to see if.
Yep. Okay.
Here we go.
Great to join the panel. I hope you can hear me well. So it's wonderful to talk about this important issue. It's a joint work with Michael Taylor at Auburn University. Next slide, please. So Chinese ownership of U.S. agricultural land has received a lot of attention across the media and political attentions, and not only related to the total acres of Chinese ownership, but also the sensitivity of Chinese ownership, especially in, for example, in North Dakota near military bases. There are several federal and state level legislations related to foreign land ownership, especially related to Chinese ownership of foreign land, US land as well. Next slide, please. if we think about the federal regulations, there's one act called the American Foreign Land Investment Disclosure Act, which doesn't necessarily ban the foreign land ownership, but authorize the voluntary disclosure of foreign entities, mainly companies, to report and disclose to USDA their land holdings, not only acquisitions, but also long-term leases with at least 10 years or more. One point to note is that these acres are not spatially identified to the latitude, longitude. It's only identified through counties. Next slide, please. So when we look at the foreign land ownership in particular, that we are only talking about tiny slices of U.S. farmland. It's about 3.4% of U.S. farmland, or 43 million acres of land that is owned by all foreign acres. But it is a growing concern. If you're looking at this land, this chart that this shows you globally how the land owned by foreign interests over time, owned or leased by foreign entities over time. And you can see a significant increase over the past 20 years has increased, especially through long-term leases of cropland, mainly primarily used for solar or wind energy employment as part of the long-term leases. Next slide, please. When we zoom in for Chinese ownership, there are a lot of states, about half the states in the United States have seeks to restrict certain entities, especially so-called adversary countries, including China, to giving access to private land, agricultural land. And there are also federal legislations that try to mandate reporting of leases rather than 10 years of in terms of leasehold, rather than reporting 5 years or longer. National Agricultural Land Law Center at University of Arkansas reports a lot of interesting updates about the current legislation at the state level. So I encourage you to check that out. Next slide, please. So when we are zooming in for all the top countries owned by owned or leased US land, China is actually not the top countries. In fact, it's the OECD countries or US allies are the top countries. In this one, you can see clearly that Canada is the top country that owns or leases the vast amounts of the US farmland, is about 12 million acres. And in contrast, China ranks number 18 across the spectrum. And however, if you're looking at additional foreign purchases, not only Canada acquired more US farmland, China has accelerated the pace of US farmland acquisition as well. Next slide, please. Next, please. So again, this is a chart that shows you the division of foreign land ownership by US allies and adversaries, including China. And you can see the vast majority of the land that is owned by foreign companies or individuals are actually owned by US allies as opposed to US adversaries, including China. Next slide, please. In particular, for Chinese investment in US agricultural land, there are two important episodes that you want to pay attention. One is the famous 2013 Smithfield Foods acquisition, where when Chinese companies acquire Smithfield Foods, they also acquired subsidiary Murphy Brown companies and also their land holdings, which resulted in the significant jump in the land holding they have to report to USDA. Another one is related to one billionaire Sun Guangxin in 140,000 acres in one particular county in Texas. So next slide, please. You can see visually where Chinese land holdings compared to Canadian land holdings visually in US farmland. And you can see that a lot of the land holdings in China are isolated in certain counties and related to specific purchases, as opposed to the Canadian land holdings where they concentrated in outright forest land ownership, as well as leases of cropland for renewable energy contracts. Next slide, please. So one last thing I want to mention is that if you're thinking about Chinese overseas investments, that US represents the blues, the significant investment is the Smithfield Foods acquisition. A lot of the investments are in the yellow countries, which is in Belt and Road countries. So there is conscious strategic investments by China to invest in other countries along the Belt and Road initiatives. And next slide, please. And the one last thing I want to check is that USDA is aware of the probably the lack of accuracy or the accountability in the data sharing regarding foreign land ownership. There's a lot of efforts to try to improve the data gathering offered by, for example, in the Government Accountability Office report as well. Thank you very much for your interest.
Great, thanks so much, Wendong, for your presentation. And last but not least, I want to welcome Brian.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present here, and it's good to catch up with everyone, old academic colleagues. You asked me to talk a bit about US-China agricultural cooperation and the future. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, whether and how, where are we going with it? Do we want to continue to do it, and how we might go about doing that? Next slide, please. Real quick, I'll talk a little bit about some history of US-China ag cooperation, and then do we want to continue? Does China want us to continue? I think that's a significant question. And what is the future? And then methodology. And next slide, please. The methodology will be essentially just bringing my experience to the topic. No data really in this one. When I started thinking about it, I thought about, I've been doing a lot of this. I worked for ERS for 10 years as a China specialist. I worked for Bunge for several years in Shanghai. I worked for the US Grains Council promoting grain exports for another decade. And now I'm back at the Academy in California. But, US-China cooperation, agricultural cooperation has been a fundamental part of the diplomatic relationship since the beginning. The Scientific Cooperation Exchange Program, SCEP program, was signed in 78, 79. As soon as we established diplomatic relations, it was one of the first, if not the first, exchange programs. USDA cooperators have been in China since the beginning. The Grains Council, I worked for them. They built a feed mill in 1984, used that for training. It's been an important part of the relationship. Emerging Markets Program started in the 90s. Its name was changed. It was originally the Emerging Democracies Program, but after 89, they decided to change the name to Emerging Markets in order to include China. That goes primarily to businesses that want to find ways to overcome problems or policies that affect their exports or various constraints to their exports. But a lot of it was given to US government agencies as well. ERS got a bunch of it as well. And then of course, universities and industry have been cooperating quite a bit over the past 40 years. Now, why we've been doing this, I'll go into this more later, but quick review, because it's a good thing to do, it's the right thing to do. Certainly in the beginning, China was very poor, and it was part of building a relationship with China, but also to build demand and facilitate exports. That's why the cooperators were doing it. To get information, Emerging Markets Program in the 90s was to work with the Statistical Bureau to understand better supply and demand in trade. After China joined WTO in 2000, there was a motivation to work on trade issues, or trade policies together, global trade policies. That didn't work out too well. When Doha collapsed, essentially China and the US were on opposite sides of that. And then in the Obama administration, there was an effort to work on climate change issues, but that didn't go, that hasn't worked out too well either. One, China is sort of taking the lead in solar and electric cars and wind power and things like that. But also there's a lot of, well, you hear in China a lot that the carbon load in the atmosphere is the industrial country's problem. You know, that's been built up over the years, and it's, you know, why should China help resolve that? So there's a little bit of that going on. These are some pictures of me in various states of hair over the years. Next slide, please. So all of those pictures, by the way, were on an emerging markets program, a scientific exchange program, or working for a cooperator. Still a lot of areas we can cooperate on. Manure management is an issue that I think it's really big in China. It's been big here. It's a big constraint. I used to say at the Grains Council, the #1 constraint to expanding livestock production in China. #2, soil conservation. That's another issue that we struggle with here. A lot of the, you know, the corn organizations are working with their farmers to improve soil conservation. And I think that's a great opportunity for exchange. Actually, that is starting to occur already. Consumption, health, nutrition, these are also areas that we work on, struggle with. And I think China is struggling with that too. It might be a little more sensitive, but I think these are areas. I want to point out soil conservation. This is a book written over a century ago by a USDA scientist that went to China, Korea, and Japan to look at how they've preserved their soils for 40 centuries, motivated by the fact that the East Coast soils in the US were becoming depleted. And so it's interesting to see that this kind of back and forth has been going on a long time. Next slide, please. Why have we been doing this? Well, you know, a lot of it was to build demand, facilitate exports. That's why the cooperators are doing it. That's why a lot of companies are doing it. And to get market information on basic things like supply and demand. These are public in the US. You can get them off the internet, but in China, it's much more difficult to get accurate information that kind of adds up and makes sense. But what's interesting is that these things are highly suspect in China. I mean, even just saying we're trying to build demand, you know, a lot of people will understand it, but a lot of times you get the old, aha, see, you're not doing it just for altruistic reasons. You've got some other motivation. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with China importing corn. They're exporting to the US and they're earning dollars, and spending those dollars on corn where it would help their livestock industry is good. So this is increasingly a problem, though. You increasingly get people questioning your motivations. Next slide, please. And that stated, there's still a lot of reasons. I think Holly pointed out there's lots of, you know, China's a huge market for US ag exports. For bulk commodities in particular, you know, the producers there's thousands of them or more. And so working together with cooperators and whatnot to develop a cooperation is a good idea. There's incentives to engage and share understanding. Universities and industries, of course, have incentives, and the USDA right now, the JCCT, or JCCA, the Joint Center for Cooperation in Agriculture, whatever, the diplomatic agreement, President Xi, President Biden have agreed to continue to work on agricultural issues. So it's part of the diplomatic relationship, but it's increasingly difficult. China has an NGO law that makes it much more difficult for people in China to work on these issues. Market information is far more sensitive. the Grains Council used to do field tours to look at the corn crop. I used to do it when I was at Bunge. And you just can't do that anymore. You can get in trouble. In fact, even talking about corn production, I would be worried whether I'd get a knock on the door sometimes. And the general environment is that you know, these motivations are more suspect. So it's not for the faint of heart, but there's a lot of reasons to stay involved with China and to stay engaged, and there's a lot of areas to engage with. So last slide, real quick. Summarize. There's sufficient motivation. China is still a big importer, but convincing skeptics on both sides. You know, in China, you know, we're not being imperialistic by just because we expect something in return. You should expect that we expect something in return. And in the U.S., you know, the Grains Council, we built up a corn import demand and then 3 anti-dumping investigations, a biotech rejection. It doesn't spare you from being involved in trade disputes. And so you gotta be prepared for that. All right, I look forward to questions. Thank you for the opportunity.